Welcome to another video about International Baccalaureate's Environmental Systems and Societies. Today we're going to go through topic 2.1, Species and Populations. The first big idea in this topic, of course, is that species interact with the living and non-living components of their environment, and the way that they interact with those components of the environment defines the ecological niche or the role that that species plays within that environment. First, you need to know the definition of species. There are a bunch of different ways that we can define species depending on how closely we examine them. A lot of species are identified through the use of genetics. The primary thing that we have here is that they have common characteristics and they interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So here on the screen, you see a bunch of different dog breeds. Right? They all look differently, but they have common characteristics. Each of those breeds is capable of interbreeding with the other breeds, and the offspring they produce are fertile, therefore they are all the same species. Right? Donkeys and horses, right, are in the same genus, which means they're closely related, and they are capable of interbreeding to produce a mule. But the offspring are not fertile. In other words, the mules cannot breed and produce offspring. Therefore, donkeys and horses are different species. Same thing with lions and tigers. They're closely related. They're in the same genus, and they are in fact capable of interbreeding and producing an offspring, but those offspring are sterile. Therefore, lions and tigers are classified biologically as different species. Another big definition you need to know is habitat. I think most of you are probably familiar with this from grade school or middle school classes, but it is the environment in which a species normally lives. In this picture, you've got a northern spotted woodpecker, and this appears to be a temperate deciduous forest where it's found. Generally, we're going to classify or group habitats into two main categories. Terrestrial habitats are those based on land, and aquatic habitats are those that are dominated by water. Aquatic habitats are generally further subdivided into marine habitats based on saltwater, or freshwater habitats, which may include lakes, rivers, or streams. Terrestrial habitats, there's a bunch of them, and tend to think of those more as the types of biomes that we find distributed around the land masses on our planet. We're going to come back to this idea of an ecological niche for a moment. It's the particular abiotic or non-living and biotic or living conditions and interactions that organisms have with their environment. Right? So abiotic, the non-living factors of ecological niches: air, water temperature, the water salinity, the clarity of the water, the temperature of the water, different types of soil characteristics, that's soil texture, that's the nutrient, the level of nutrients that are available in the soils. All of those things are not living. The biotic factors, the living factors of an ecological niche, essentially are the way that an organism interacts with other living parts of its environment. So what does it hunt? What hunts it? Who are its predators? Who are its prey? What about the competitors for the same types of resources? What about those organisms that help it survive? So you have symbiotic relationships or mutualistic relationships. And we should be able to give you some examples of each one of those types of biotic relationships. All right. A niche describes the particular set of living and non-living conditions and resources to which an organism or a population of organisms responds. In this image, we've got 5 different species of warblers. Right? And even though they may all live physically in the same tree, they actually have different ecological niches. And those niches are defined by their food sources. Some of them may specifically be focused on seeds. Some of them may be insect hunters. Some of them tend to physically occupy the upper layers of the canopy. Some of them live closer to the ground. And by occupying different physical spaces within that tree, the warblers avoid competition and they've secured their own unique role or niche within the environment. And here we are back in East Africa again, and we've got zebras, wildebeest, and gazelle in this picture, all occupying the same physical space, but they have different ecological niches because of the food that they eat. Zebras come through and they eat all the tall grass first. Then the wildebeest follow and they eat what's left over. And then after the grasses have recovered, after the zebras and the wildebeest have eaten them, the gazelles then follow through. And what the gazelles focus on are the brand new shoots that come up. So in this way, the constant changing of vegetation supports different populations of animals. You should be able to distinguish between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. Right? The fundamental niche is the full range of where an organism could potentially live if there weren't other competitors or other factors that limit its population growth. The realized niche is the niche where that organism is actually found as a result of competition with other organisms or limitations of some of those abiotic factors in the environment, such as salinity levels, light levels, or temperature range. Right? So the fundamental niche is everywhere you could possibly find an organism. So think about it like the full range of a bell curve. But the realized niche is really that central part of the bell curve where you generally find the organism. Here are your abiotic factors that influence the ecological niche of organisms. Sunlight, temperature, pH, salinity levels, precipitation. These are all of the non-living components of an ecosystem. Biotic factors. These are the relationships that an organism has with other organisms. Classic example here is predation. Right? So the owl and the mouse have a relationship, benefits the owl, the mouse, not so much. Herbivory is essentially hunting plants. So here we have a lot of caterpillars feasting away on a leaf. Doesn't really benefit the leaf in any way, but it sure benefits the caterpillars. We also have parasitism. This is where one species depends on another for nutrition, and it harms the host. So here we have a bunch of aphids or mites, and they are getting all of the sap out of this plant that provides the insects with energy, a form of sustenance, but it damages the plant and it weakens the plant, potentially exposing it to disease pathogens. The second big idea in topic 2.1 is that populations change and respond based on the way that they interact with the physical environment. In this image here, it's a simplified map of California. This whole coastal zone has lots of mountains. Here's where all of your redwoods are found. And this zone here is also mountainous. And those zones are separated by the Central Valley, which is where most of the major agriculture in California happens. Each of these areas has a unique and different set of biotic and abiotic factors. And as a result, the amphibians, or these salamanders that have lived in those areas, over time have changed in response to the selective pressures that the environment in that particular location has exerted on them. What do I mean by selective pressure? Well, these are the things that prevent populations from just continually growing. So disease, parasites, accidents, predation from other organisms, starvation, which is a limit to the food size. If you have people involved, it may include the number of organisms that are hunted. You can see here, right, that the population size increases, and these selective pressures are what push the population size back down to the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity being the maximum number of organisms that a particular location can support indefinitely. So starvation, disease, parasites, accidents, severe weather events, tornadoes, wildfires, hunting, predation, all of those things limit population growth. And that's why they're called selective pressure, because they put downward pressure on population growth. Population dynamics, carrying capacity. Here's where we get into those relationships between different biotic components of an ecosystem. On the screen, you've got two very classic examples, and I recommend you just memorize both of these examples so you can use them on your IB ESS exam. The first one here on the left is the relationship between wolf and moose populations at Isle Royale National Park in the United States. The moose population is red, and the wolf population is blue. As you can see, when there are a lot of moose, there's a lot of food available for wolves because wolves hunt moose. So when there are then enough food, a lot of wolves survive, which means there are a lot of wolves eating moose, and the moose population falls. And when the moose population falls, suddenly there's not enough food for that many wolves, and so the wolf population begins to decline. And as the wolf population begins to decline, there's less selective pressure on the moose population, and so the moose population increases again, which then, of course, provides more food for the wolf. Right? This is one of those feedback mechanisms that we've previously addressed in topic 1. Right? So you'll notice both of the populations fluctuate around kind of a standard level. That's the idea of a carrying capacity. We see a very, very similar type of relationship between the lynx, which is a hunting cat that lives in Canada, which is the orange line, and the snowshoe hare, which is in the rabbit and rodent family. Right? The lynx, being a cat, it's a hunter, hunts the rabbits, hunts the hares, and you get the exact same kind of relationship. They both fluctuate around a dynamic, stable state equilibrium. Now let's look at the next level of organization, which is a population. And so a population is a group of organisms, all of the same species that live in the same area at the same time, and they interbreed. I used to live in Tanzania, and we had different populations of elephants in Tanzania. So up here in this purple area, that's the Serengeti, Ngorongoro, Kilimanjaro corridor. All of these elephants that live here are the same species as the elephants that we would find down here in Ruaha and Mikumi and Selous. But because of the high degree of human population, agriculture, and cities that you find between those areas, the elephants up here in the Serengeti and Ngorongoro Kilimanjaro corridor never interact with the elephants down here. Therefore, you have the population in the purple areas separate from populations in the orange areas, right? So they're the same species, but they are different populations. And this has some significant impacts on biodiversity and its conservation, which we'll get into when we discuss topic 3 later on. Just like the elephants in Tanzania, we see a similar concept here in Southeast Asia. The circles on this map all represent different populations of the Asian elephant. Now, Asian elephants are a different species from African elephants. So in Tanzania, we have different populations of African elephants. That's the Loxodonta africana. In Southeast Asia, we have a different species, Elephas maximus. It's a different genus. They are related to one another, but they're not the same species. So the African elephants and the Asian elephants are not populations of the same species. They're different species. But within Southeast Asia, all of these areas represented by the circles on the map are the same species of Elephas maximus, the Asian elephant. So they're found in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Laos, in China, in India, in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, in Cambodia. All of the elephants found in this part of the world are the same species, right? And so all of the Asian elephants in Malaysia may be capable of interbreeding because they're living in the same area at the same time, right? But they're probably isolated from the Sri Lankan and Indian elephants populations because there's a physical barrier, the ocean, between those populations. Big idea. This is a vocabulary word you need to know. Carrying capacity. Right? And you can see it here. This is the breeding stock or the number of survivors in that annual cycle of life and death. And the way that populations grow and change and respond to the selective pressures that we have right here, right, defines what kind of survival strategy that species uses. And we classify them by the shape of their population growth curves. So we can call them a J curve because it represents the letter J, or an S curve because it represents the letter S. What tends to happen with your J curves is the population increases very rapidly. It overshoots the carrying capacity, and then the population experiences kind of a catastrophic drop off with high rates of mortality and death. Whereas the S curve, the population increases quite rapidly at first, but then its increase begins to level off till it settles right around that carrying capacity. So here are those limiting factors. How do limiting factors increase pressure, the selective pressure on populations to create this idea of a carrying capacity? The organisms that are healthiest resist disease and parasites and survive. The organisms that are most adapted to finding enough food to survive, they can survive and breed again. The organisms that are most afraid of people tend to avoid being hunted, and they survive to breed again. That's the idea of the carrying capacity. You will probably be asked to interpret graphical representations of different relationships. The predator-prey relationship comes up very, very regularly in IB ESS exams. I recommend you know this one very well. Explain these population growth curves in terms of the numbers and the rates. So your J curves here, your R strategists, they grow very, very rapidly. That's the rate. Their numbers exceed the carrying capacity, and then they experience very rapid dieback or mortality rates. Their numbers increase more slowly. The growth rate tends to level off around the carrying capacity, and they experience less extreme mortality and dieback once they reach the carrying capacity. Change in one community can have impacts on other communities. We sometimes see this referred to as the butterfly effect, but I'm going to come back to the elephants that we were looking at just a few minutes ago. Elephants shape the landscape. So if elephant populations decrease due to poaching or some type of catastrophic weather event or a disease that comes through an area, the landscape itself and the combination of habitats that are available to other organisms will change because the elephants are the architects and the engineers of that ecosystem. Right? So changing the elephant community can impact the communities of zebras and gazelles or the birds that live in that particular ecosystem. Right? That's it for ESS topic 2.1. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, give it a like, consider subscribing to my channel. And of course, you can find a lot more ESS materials on my website, www.mrcreamerscience.com.